time for the main event, as we like to say, you know. We are obviously not in a battle arena here, but it is our main point. I'm in your way. Let's move. You don't want to say anything, you know? So I would like to introduce Tim Svoboda. Those of you who don't know Tim, he and his wife, Carol, they served with YWAM in India for 25 years. They raised their kids in India. 10 years ago, they came back to the US to take over the leadership over this location, as well as are the Bay Area coordinators. And Tim also has his doctorate in ministry that he earned at Marquis University. And yeah, tonight he's going to speak about City of Saints and Servants, and I would like to ask him to come up front and bless us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Boy, this thing's wobbling. All right, great to be with you guys tonight and to share. And I want to just share something with you. I was inspired by what Steve just shared. And Mark Scamrat, who's with us tonight, he has a little tradition that he does called Word on the Street. And I always like reading his Facebook posts he finds different signs on the street. And I found one the other day. It was a poem pasted on the wall of the Larkin Street Post Office that they're demolishing right now. And it says, "You see, I see," written by a student from Demiriac Academy here in the Tenderloin. And she said, you see gum-covered dark gray pavement. I see a man on the pavement praying for help. You see an ambulance proving how dangerous this neighborhood is, but I see a person who is about to save the life of another. You see a beige building with broken windows and stained walls, and I see a mom taking care of her 4 children, saving all her money for their future. You see a gloomy neighborhood, scary and stained. I see a hopeful community, learning and living. Isn't that beautiful? Yes. Now, as missionaries, we are called to love the people and to love the place where we are. And to be compassionate and yet prophetic. That's the role of the missionary. We're called to love the people and the place where we are, being both compassionate and prophetic. And San Francisco always throws challenges at us like no other city. And I think that's the same when we look at this whole situation that I want to talk about tonight, the growth of the church in the city of San Francisco. And before I get into some of the saints and servants of San Francisco, understanding a little bit of the context of San Francisco back in the day. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right. 1846. In 1846, San Francisco had just 300 people. By 1849, what happened in 1849? All right, 1849, it began to boom to 2000. By the end of 1849, 25,000 people were living in San Francisco. Right? I'm taking some of these facts from a book called Mud, Blood, and Gold. It's written on the first year of San Francisco. And by the way, as I share tonight, we will be, at the end of my message, we will be giving a contest, and we're giving away 3 books. If you can answer the questions. So you want to pay attention to what I'm saying, because the questions are going to come from the lecture tonight. We were trying to get you this book, Mud, Blood, and Gold, but we just found out that it's completely sold out and it's not available anymore in the bookstores. So we're going to be giving away tonight 3 books, 2 of them are the same, Season of the Witch by David Talbot. If you haven't read it, it's one of the best books written on the city of San Francisco. And the other book that we're going to give away tonight is called The Infinite City, an Atlas of San Francisco. And it's 22 psychological maps of the city of San Francisco. So make sure you listen to what I'm saying, because there are going to be maybe some tricky questions that are going to come up at the end. So 1846, 700 ships came that year from all over the world. So you begin to see the city booming. The hallmark of the gold rush was greed. And so this was the prevailing factor in San Francisco. And San Francisco back in 1849 was not what we see today. It was a city of tents. It was a city of wooden shacks. It was so crowded and there was nowhere to sleep that some men were sleeping inside of coffins just to find a place to sleep. And so it was a very, very crowded city. It was an every man for himself creed, and San Francisco was a transient town. Still the same today, isn't it? Yes. One of the pastors, Jeff Garner, told me that he's baptized more than 500 people in San Francisco, but he's only got about 100 and some people to show in his church. And it's because people keep coming and keep going, through the city. I think it was Mark that told me about every 5 years San Francisco flushes out about its entire population. And so San Francisco remains still a very transient town, and difficult to put our roots down. Men outnumbered women 70 to 1 in 1849, and of the 300 women, 200 were prostitutes. San Francisco was proclaimed the wickedest town in the USA up until the 1920s. Right? So this is the context, and I'm not going to go deep into all the context of San Francisco, but it's important to understand a little bit of the context that the preachers faced back in that day. By the end of 1849, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of gambling houses. And I'm taking this from the book Mud, Blood, and Gold, which is, the entire book is on 1 year of San Francisco, and that was the year 1849. The entire book is only on 1 year of the city. And he says there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of gambling houses with saloons attached. Gambling was a 24/7 business in the city of San Francisco. $20,000 could change hands on the turn of a card, right? So San Francisco was an extremely rich city. It was a very greedy city. And it was a very challenging city. A second-hand Webster's dictionary in 1849 sold for $25. Wow. Dozen eggs. How much do a dozen eggs go for today? For a dozen eggs?
$3.49.
$3.49. 1849, a dozen eggs went for $6 to $9. Back in 1849. Right? So, San Francisco was a city of greed. It was a city of opportunity. No different than it is today. All right? Let's see. Miners netted about $1,350 a week, while local Indians made about $10. The average wage in the United States at that time was $1 to $2 per day.
Nice.
Right. So, the economy in San Francisco was booming, and the shopkeepers were mining the miners. So the miners were out searching for gold, striking it rich, but the shopkeepers began to raise their prices because of the tremendous opportunity that they had in front of them. Suicide was the second leading cause of death in 1849. There was tremendous opportunity, but there was also tremendous failure that went on and tremendous loss of money. And so in this mix, the church is challenged and has to figure out how to begin to grow. Between 1849 and 1851, San Francisco was almost destroyed by fire 7 times. Wow. Right? So, we look at the seal of San Francisco, and what do you see fading in the background there? It's our city bird. Yeah. And what's our city bird? It's the phoenix. And what does the phoenix symbolize? We rise from the ashes, all right? The seal of San Francisco is a phoenix which rises from the ashes. And we've seen that over and over in the city of San Francisco, where fire has tried to destroy the city, and yet San Francisco keeps coming back. The Azusa Revival started on April 9th, 1906, and the great earthquake and fire took place in San Francisco on April 18th of the same year. Some people said God visited Los Angeles and he judged San Francisco. Right? So that was the mentality that was going on. The East Coast papers, when the earthquake took place, the headlines was, Sin City gets its just reward. That was the reputation that San Francisco had back in the day. Now, in this mix, the church begins to figure out how it can grow. There was a whiskey store down on downtown. It's still there, called Hotelling's Whiskey. And they didn't have the same view as people saying that God judged San Francisco. In fact, they came up with this little poem. They said, if, as they say, God spanked the town for being over frisky, why did he burn his churches down and spare Hotelling's Whiskey? So Hotelling's Whiskey downtown was one of the only buildings that remained during the 1906 earthquake. And so the city had that defiant attitude that, we're going to go on and continue to do what we do. The preachers that were coming into San Francisco, churches were very small, even as some of them still are today. When you read the beginning of church history in San Francisco, you find that churches were 5, 10, 15, 25 people, and people were more interested in mining gold and in gambling and in the brothels than they were in attending church. And so this was a challenge that was faced by the early preachers that came. So we back up a little bit to 1579. Sir Francis Drake landed 30 miles north of San Francisco in 1579. His ship's chaplain, Francis Fletcher, conducted a service in English on St. John the Baptist Day, which was the first known English Protestant service in the continent. You see a cross here. This cross is in Golden Gate Park, giving memory back to Sir Francis Drake, Francis Fletcher, back in 1579. So I'm trying to trace how did the gospel come into the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the first instances that we hear about is this incident of Sir Francis Drake and Francis Fletcher landing and conducting a service. It was on St. John's the Baptist Day, and the text was Isaiah chapter 40. And so this is one of the first instances. And then, of course, the mission in Dolores Park, which you see here, the old chapel, was founded October 9th, 1776. The settlement was named for St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order, but was nearby a creek, which was named the Creek of Sorrows. Dolores is the name for sorrows in Spanish, because it was discovered on the Friday before Palm Sunday, which is Friday of Sorrows in the Lent season. So the name Mission Dolores stuck more than the other name. And this was one of the first churches that began to spring up in the city, 1776. And of course, it was just a small little village. San Francisco at that time, the population was very, very tiny. But a mission began here in San Francisco and slowly began to take root. All right, can we get the next one here? All right, June 7th, skipping ahead, 1846, Captain John B. Montgomery. We have Montgomery Street downtown, named after John B. Montgomery. A Protestant elder landed in San Francisco, holding church services on board his ship. And so this is in 1846, before the gold rush, with John Montgomery. Samuel Brannan. We have Brannan Avenue here in San Francisco. Brannan Street, named after Samuel Brannan, arrived July 1846 with 238 members of the Latter-day Saints. which doubled the population of the city and transformed the Catholic village to a mostly Mormon settlement overnight. So you begin to see different mixes coming in, and then, let's see here. Cassie, I think you're going to have to operate it for me. You got disconnected here. Let's see here. All right. The first Protestant church was on Powell Street at Washington. You can see this is not the first one, but this is what was built a little bit later on. The first Protestant church was on Powell Street in Washington. Services were held in a shanty with a blue cover, and it was really in the bushes. That's all that was there. It was kind of like a desolate place. By Methodist preachers Asa White and William Roberts. Later on, this is one of the first churches that was built in San Francisco on the same site. And so you can still see it kind of looks like a little cabin in the woods. Not like our San Francisco today that we see. That was the nature of what the city was like. All right. William Taylor pastored the church on Powell and Washington. You see William Taylor here. This is Bishop William Taylor. He was a very big guy, barrel-chested, deep baritone voice. And there's a book in the San Francisco library called 7 Years of Street Preaching in San Francisco. And it's all his sermons. He preached 600 sermons in a period of 7 years, standing on whiskey barrels, on pianos in bars, or on crates in Portsmouth Square, preaching the gospel. And the guy was just absolutely incredible in what he accomplished and what he did. His crowds grew so large that they started to block up the entrances to the gambling saloons facing the square. When the proprietors complained, Taylor exclaimed that his listeners were merely blocking the entrance to hell. So this guy was he was incredibly bold. He preached with all of his heart, and he was a very very bold preacher. The situation was very difficult. The situation was very rough. In the Parker House, which was a hotel in downtown San Francisco, some of the first sermons that were preached there were by Asa White and Roberts, who I said before. And while they were preaching, gambling was going on right around them. And one of the old sailors, after Roberts got up and preached in the gambling hall, he took his hat off and he passed his hat around and took up an offering for the preacher. And he walked up to William Roberts and he said, "That was a damn good sermon." And that was kind of the nature of San Francisco. So we find these guys coming in. This guy here, William Taylor, he lived on a ship while he was building his church. And he would also go down to the pier. And whenever ships came in, when ships were coming in all the time, bringing people in to find gold, Taylor would stand on the pier and he would sing hymns and he would preach the gospel. And he finally became the port chaplain here in the city. He visited the city hospitals almost every single day, and he attended to the sick. He sat with the patients. He wrote letters on their behalf, and he consoled them while they were dying. This guy was one of the incredible guys. If you go down to Leavenworth Street and McAllister, the tall UC Hastings building, the dormitory, it's like a 15-story building. If you look down at the bottom, it no longer is, an old church, and it was the William Taylor Methodist Church here in San Francisco. And now it's been closed and no longer in operation. All right, this is First Baptist Church. We all know First Baptist Church over in Octavia, but this was the very first First Baptist Church back in 1849. And the pastor was Reverend Osgood Wheeler, and he left New York City by boat on December 1st, 1848. And while he was sailing, he left New York to go to the frontier of California. He knew that he was going to a place where it was just only a few people. And it was in the woods, and it was out in the wild. The city of San Francisco, which was only a couple hundred people at that time. And as he got on the boat and he was sailing, gold was discovered. And when his boat landed in San Francisco, he was shocked at what he saw, with people all over the streets, living in tents, and he began to take up his appointment and began to preach the gospel. So this was one of the first churches, and the first baptism that they had at First Baptist Church. Well, this church, let me just go back to this. This church here cost $6,000 to build, and the roof that you're looking at was made out of a ship's sail. And the first convert that they had, there was no proper baptistry in this church. And so the first convert that they had, they took the convert down to the shores of North Beach. And the mayor, government officials, representatives of the Navy, the Marines, and the Prime Minister of Hawaii all went down to the seashore and watched the first convert take baptism. So this was the very first Baptist church. This is the second. Now this one burned down. The first one here in 1849 burned down, and then they moved to this second one over here. And this was First Baptist Church, believe it or not, just one block away over here on Eddy Street between Jones and Leavenworth. This is 1906, and then this is before 1906, I'm sorry. And then this one came down in the earthquake, and then of course we see the present First Day Baptist Church today that was built in 1908, the same time that this building that we're sitting in was built in 1908. So little history on the First Baptist Church and what took place. This is Trinity Episcopal Church at 1668 Bush Street. It was founded in 1849. And it was, the first preacher there was Reverend Flavel Scott Mines. And the church cost $60,000 to build. And Reverend Flavel Scott Mines, he said at the dedication, "Let San Francisco become another Antioch, the mother city of churches." And unfortunately, that didn't always become true. San Francisco went in some other directions, but that was the intent of Trinity Episcopal Church. Then you're looking here at First Congregational Church, again through the years. The one that they had here at California in DuPont Streets was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake, and they moved over to this one here. This one is on Post and Mason. It's still there, but it's no longer used by First Congregational Church. It was sold to the Academy of the Arts, and it's now on Polk Street at 1323 Polk Street. And the pastor there was Reverend Timothy Dwight Hunt, and he was a missionary in Hawaii. And when the gold rush took place, half of his congregation, or more than half of his congregation, left for San Francisco to come hunting for gold. And so then he got on a ship and he followed them to preach the gospel and to plant a church over here. He had, in one of his services, he had a lady, a very famous lady, Mrs. Beezer Simmons. She came to sing in his church. And the news spread like wildfire because there were literally no women in San Francisco at that time. And so everybody came out to hear Mrs. Beezer sing her song. And the proprietor of the famous Parker Hotel or Parker House, which was a gambling joint, he even came out to hear her sing. And this church became known as the Church with a Heart in the heart of the city. All right, and then we move over to a little bit near to Chinatown and Donaldina, Cameroon, and some of the incredible history that we find from her. This was, she came to San Francisco and began to reach out. Let me just see if I can miss this slide here. Hold on a second. No. She began to reach out to the Chinese girls that were sold into prostitution. One of the problems here was with the Chinese men was that they couldn't get their wives to come over. They were not allowed to bring their wives to San Francisco. And so prostitution and slavery became a huge issue in San Francisco. And Donaldina Cameron rose up to meet this need. The life of the average Chinese prostitute was about 5 years in length. And Donaldina Cameron took up this problem, and the members of the Fighting Tongs, many of them who were slave owners, they didn't take the loss of their property very lightly. They saw their prostitutes as valuable property, and they were fetching prices in thousands of dollars for them. And so Donaldina Cameron was always under legal and physical assault. Her boss, Margaret Culbertson, suffered a complete, total breakdown from fighting for the freedom of these girls and the physical assaults that were taking place. And then Donaldina suffered a total breakdown, but while she had the breakdown, she refused to stop her work, and she kept on going because she was so compassionate and she was so concerned about the girls that she was trying to rescue. The Chinese men called her the foreign devil, and the girls that she rescued called her their old mother. And so it's quite a story. You see the Cameron house here, the Donaldina Cameron house. It was completely destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. They actually had to dynamite it to stop the fire from spreading in other directions. And so they blew it up. And the present one that you see today has been built from the burnt bricks of the fire and put back together. And Donaldina Cameron was a master. They said that she was a master at finding Chinese young girl prostitutes hidden in tunnels by their masters inside of their homes. She worked closely with the police, and she became a master at locating girls and then rescuing them and getting them out of their slavery. So another great saint of San Francisco. By 1880, the city's population was 234,000 people and had about 100 churches. So you see the city starting to grow, and churches are starting to take on the challenge and respond. By 1900, there were 343,000 people and 175 churches. Now, in missiology, we have a formula that we go by. It's not always the best thing, but we use a little formula called one church for every 1,000 people. When a city reaches one church for every 1,000 people, we say the city is saturated with the gospel. Now, we may saturate it with many churches, but the churches may not be very saturated themselves with the gospel. That's why it's a bad formula, you see. But nevertheless, it gives you a little indication. And so here, 343,000 people would require 343 churches. And we see 175 that are there. So that's a little formula that's used in many church planting contexts in Asia, in different places. So it helps you to track where is the city at, and I'll be giving a figure at the end of where we are in recent history. By 1890, there were 26,000 Chinese, and by 1892, there were 15 Chinese temples. So you see the religious diversity beginning to grow in the city of San Francisco. William Spear of the Presbyterian Church of Chinatown started a bilingual newspaper called The Oriental. And he wasn't the only guy that had published newspapers. There were many Christians that had published newspapers and were circulating them throughout San Francisco. By the 1850s, there were people like Sam Brannan's California Star, William Taylor's California Christian Advocate, the Mirror of Times, and then the Oriental. So these were all newspapers that were circulating and sharing the gospel, and also giving the news inside the city. The Japanese Gospel Society started in 1877. The first Japanese convert in America was here in the city of San Francisco. And so we see the beginnings of the Japanese Gospel Society that took place. And then we see more diversity coming into the city. The Unitarian Universalist Church started in 1889, and one of the leaders of that, or the main pastor of that church, was Reverend Thomas Starr King. Did I get it right? Reverend Thomas Starr King was the main leader. He was a brilliant speaker, and someone who was very well thought out. He took up issue with California trying to become a separate republic. And so he helped California to stay within the Union. And he also took up a campaign to abolish slavery. And so he was highly respected by Abraham Lincoln and by others. And when he moved to San Francisco, he was a very small guy physically, 120 pounds. And when he came to San Francisco and he walked into the Unitarian Universalist Church, the congregation looked at him and was wondering, what can this little scrawny, skinny guy do for the city of San Francisco? And he knew that comment was being made, and he got up in the pulpit and he said, "Though I weigh only 120 pounds, when I am mad, I weigh a ton." And he became quite a fiery preacher here in San Francisco. The Swedenborgian Church, still in existence, 1895, that did suffer in the earthquake. I don't know if you've seen it up in Pacific Heights, but it's really a beautiful church. And then Swami Vivekananda from the Vedanta Society of India. He came to Chicago for the World Parliament of Religions, where he stunned the audience with his speech on that all religions are the same. And then this house became the Vedanta Society in San Francisco. No longer the headquarters of the Vedanta Society, but the house is still there. The Vedanta Society is up on Vallejo Street, a few blocks away from where this one is. But this is one of the beautiful architectural structures of San Francisco. And when you go to it, it's not necessarily Hindu or Muslim or Christian, but it's all different architecture blended together with a cross when you enter in one door and the Om symbol on another door, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the syncretism and religious pluralism that started to come in because of the diversity of San Francisco and the ethnicities that were here. And then the challenge that preachers had of trying to relate in this difference. This San Francisco Chronicle, this is 1917, skipping ahead a little bit. And this is an article that came out in the San Francisco Chronicle of 1917, January 26th, I think it was. Right up the street here on, I believe it's Leavenworth and O'Farrell, there was a church right up here called the Central Methodist Church, Reverend Paul Smith. And Reverend Paul Smith was on the vice squad here in San Francisco trying to cut down crime and prostitution. They say back in the day in this area, there were up to approximately 200 or more brothels just in the Tenderloin area alone. So it was a very heavy prostitution trade that was going on. And Reverend Paul Smith took up a campaign to shut down prostitution in San Francisco. The prostitutes took issue with him. And so you can read about this. It's online. It's in Randy Shaw's book called The Tenderloin. And 300 prostitutes gathered together with their eyebrows all fixed up and lipstick on their lips. And they marched to Reverend Paul Smith, 300 strong. And they protested and said, "Yes, our trade ought to be abolished, but if you abolish our trade, what are you going to give us to help us to live in a city where the rents are so expensive that we can't afford to be here? And the church didn't have an answer. We face that same challenge today, don't we? It's not just about taking people out of sin. It's about helping people into a new life right now where it counts. And that was a sad day. You can read this article. It's talked about a lot here in San Francisco. In fact, just a week ago, there was a march here in San Francisco commemorating the history of what took place from the community here. So as a church, we have to think, how do we exist in such a city? How do we respond to the problems that we have? It's no different. The cost of living back then is the cost of living now. And we face issues of not just saving people from their sin, but we face issues of how do we help people in everyday life. This is Smith Wigglesworth, who came to San Francisco. Glad Tidings Church. I don't know why the font got small there, but it says here, Glad Tidings Assembly of God Church, started in 1913. And Smith Wigglesworth, the controversial Pentecostal preacher who sometimes punched people in the stomach for their healings, came to San Francisco. And not just once, he came often to especially Glad Tidings Assembly of God Church, down the road here on Ellis Street in Webster. And it says here, Smith Wigglesworth visited the church several times. On one such visit, so many people wanted to hear him speak that he walked the streets of the city, and people brought out the sick on mattresses so they could be healed by the shadow of Wigglesworth as he passed by. So amazing stories of Smith Wigglesworth and what God did through his life and the visits that he had here in San Francisco. Years ago, I went over to Forrest Byers' Glad Tidings Church with a few other pastors, and we just went to go meet Forrest Byers, and the question that we had to Forrest Byers was, tell us the story of revival in San Francisco. And Glad Tidings has been at the epicenter of revival in the city for many, many decades. And Forrest Beiser began to tell us stories. And one of the stories that he told us was that not through Smith Wigglesworth, but through some other preacher that came at Glad Tidings. I don't know, he didn't remember who it was. And I just wrote Forrest Beiser to verify that I've got the story right, because I heard it years ago. But Forrest Beiser told us that one preacher came to Glad Tidings Church, and the presence of God became so strong in the church that the cloud of his glory appeared. And the cloud of his glory was so thick that the smoke or cloud began to billow out the windows of the church. And somebody in the neighborhood called the fire department, thinking that the church was on fire because they saw the smoke coming out of the building. As the fire department arrived at the store, Pastor Leland Keyes, who was a pastor at that time, the fire department came and said, hey, your church is on fire. There's smoke coming out of the buildings. And the pastor responded and said, the only thing that's on fire here are the believers. And so that story, I've asked Forrest Beiser, did that really happen? And he said, yeah, that's the story. And he said, I still have a member of the church that remembers that, has been passed that down, and they still remember it. So amazing stories of what God did in the city of San Francisco through all sorts of servants. Some that are crazy, some that may be hard to accept, and that some that were just traditional, and then God used them. Oops, this one's a little bit hard to read. That came out a little bit bad. Let me see if I can find this here. Yeah, this is Dorothy Lister Rogers. She's the president of the San Francisco Council of Churches. And she awoke during the night. This is around 1954, when I was born. She awoke during the night with the idea of an enormous prayer meeting of all faiths and all races, praying together for peace on the 10th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. And so she gathered all the religions together in San Francisco on June 19, 1955, in the Cow Palace. And 16,000 people came out who read together from the sacred books of all religions. And the festival was held again in 1965. So you see the growth of the church and the growth of the diversity of religion that's taking place in San Francisco. And then we come to the Jesus People movement, which we could spend a lot of time on in San Francisco. But it started out of, this is in the 1960s, it started out of First Baptist Church in Mill Valley in 1965 with a guy named Ted Wise, who was a hippie convert and a very conservative Pastor John McDonald, who was considered a square. And the two of them began to disciple one another. The pastor took Ted Wise under his hand, under his arms, and began to disciple him and help him to grow in the faith. Ted Wise was a hippie. He was a drug-taking beatnik who had become, as he later said, a dues-paying, meeting-going, praying out loud member of the First Baptist Church. And Pastor McDonald, who took the risk of receiving the hippies into his congregation and trying to figure out what God was doing, lost half of his regular congregation because they couldn't stand seeing these young people coming to his church service. And so that was a big risk that he took. In 1967, a small Christian commune was formed just south of Mill Valley by Ted Wise and others, and they started reaching out in Haight-Ashbury. So they were coming across from the North Bay and into San Francisco on mission, trying to reach out into Haight-Ashbury. In 1967, Pastor McDonald brought together these following people. I'm not going to read them all, but they met down in the basement of First Baptist Church over here in Octavia. And they gathered together, and they formed what was called back then Evangelical Concerns Incorporated. And they leased the Armenian Hall on Page Street, and they opened up what was called the living room. And the living room became a drop-in center in the Haight-Ashbury, where hundreds and hundreds of young people came in to have coffee, came in to get off the streets. And there were people just like what we're doing here at the drop-in center here that were discipling and reaching out with the gospel and sharing what Jesus can do in their life. During the Summer of Love, and this is the 50-year celebration this year of the Summer of Love. In the Summer of Love in 1967, 100,000 young people came to San Francisco. Looking for peace, looking for drugs, looking for experiment. And most of that 100,000, they ended up in Berkeley and Palo Alto, but most of them ended up in Haight-Ashbury. And it became a huge movement of young people. This year is the memorial for the 50-year celebration of the Jesus, not the Jesus movement, of the Summer of Love. And I just read before I came here that they're expecting 150,000 people to come for the celebration in Golden Gate Park. So this type of thing is still going on. In February 23rd, 1971, after the hippie movement or the Summer of Love, 7,000 people marched in Sacramento in a march called Spiritual Revolution Day. And they held signs, and one of the signs that was held in the parade was, "Uncle Sam, Jesus wants you." Right. So the living room was an incredible outreach where about 20 young people per week were making decisions to follow Jesus on Page Street. And one of those young people was Lonnie Frisbee. And Lonnie Frisbee was called the hippie preacher. And Lonnie Frisbee was found by Ted Wise and the gang from the living room on a street corner in Haight-Ashbury, waving a Bible and preaching about Jesus, flying saucers, and Christ consciousness. A few weeks before, Lonnie Frisbee had been wandering nude and on acid in Tuckwitz Falls near Palm Springs, where he claimed he had been confronted by Jesus and he gave his life to him. Ted and the gang took him into the living room and began to disciple him, help him to understand what it means to follow Jesus. And then Lonnie left San Francisco, and of course, we know the story. Lonnie became an incredible preacher, controversial. Again, if you read stuff, there's all different things that go back and forth about Lonnie's life. But Lonnie literally led thousands of young people to Jesus with Chuck Smith, and then from the Calvary Chapel, and then the Vineyard Church. He joined up with John Wimber, and that was when the Calvary Chapels and the Vineyards began to grow. Lonnie said that Jesus had appeared to him and said to him, "I'm going to send you to the people." And he gave him a vision of thousands of people who were wandering around in darkness, and had called Lonnie to preach the gospel to them. So amazing stories of some of the saints and some of the servants who've been in San Francisco. Today, I'm using this from 2011, so it's not as current as 2017, but today there are approximately 282 evangelical churches in the city of San Francisco. Kathy Hong is helping me with this data and trying to track on the new churches that are coming into the city. But what we're showing is about 282 evangelical churches, 93 mainline churches, 54 Roman Catholic churches, 27 churches that we just can't figure out what they are. We don't have categories, 17 Orthodox churches, and then 28 other churches that are really hard to figure out, that we just can't figure out what they belong to, but they're there. 56 Buddhist temples, 17 synagogues, 5 Hindu temples, 5 mosques, 4 interfaith centers, 1 Shinto temple, 1 Baha'i temple, and as of December 31st, 2011, the city of San Francisco and county here. So that's kind of where we're at, and I want to wrap it up as I close from some myths that Mark Scanrett, who's here in the back, spoke here one night, and I thought it'd be a great way to close our time together. Myth number 1, San Francisco is an evil city, a proverbial Sodom and Gomorrah. And Mark says, no, the reality is God is here, and he's working, bringing about healing and restoration. Amen. Let's not just focus on all the bad stuff that's going on, but let's focus on the good things that are going on, because God is present in the city of San Francisco, and he's doing wonderful things from times ago and right now in our present time. Myth number 2, San Francisco's progressive character is in conflict with the way of Jesus. And Mark says, no, the reality is the gospel of Jesus invites us to be creative, inventive, and revolutionary. Jesus wasn't revolutionary. He crossed boundaries and called long-held assumptions into question. The gospel of Jesus invites reinvention. Repent, rethink, and reimagine. So I love the way that Mark puts that for us. All right, so the next one here, let's see if I can get it. Yeah, myth number 3, the scarcity of large regional congregations in San Francisco Bay Area implies that the church is not strong. Reality, the church in the Bay Area takes many forms among diverse people groups. And we're seeing that. It's not just buildings, but it's house group movements. It's all sorts of forms that the church takes in San Francisco. Myth number 4, the transient dynamic of the San Francisco Bay Area is a barrier to the flourishing of the gospel and the church. And Mark says the reality is because of its liminality and transience, San Francisco is a liminal space that has a disproportionate influence nationally and globally. The church in San Francisco has the same kind of catalytic potential. And so we need to understand that. We're just not planting churches in San Francisco. We're influencing the world from San Francisco. People may be here for a short time. They may be here for a long time. But the gospel goes forth, as Reverend Scott Flavelmine said back in 1849. Let San Francisco be another Antioch. A church that spreads the gospel across the world. Myth number 5. San Francisco is rocky soil for the gospel. A place where Christianity is marginalized and the church is persecuted. And the reality, the church is at its best when it is stressed and marginal in a culture. Struggle and suffering produced well-formed disciples. Isn't that great? That's what San Francisco's all about. San Francisco every morning slaps us in the face. It makes us think. It makes us adapt. We either become better Christians living in San Francisco, or we give up altogether. That's what the city does for us. God bless you, and may God continue to do great things in the city of San Francisco.